Thank you, and special thanks to everybody who made this event possible today, for Jason Welly, who opened the discussion with David, to Mark Massa and the Boise Center for their hospitality, to Susie Richard for orchestrating everything, and
okay, whatever worked it was, he's good at Susie
and Maddie for the logistics. So thank you. We are very pleased to have as our guest today the Reverend Dr. David Grafton, Professor of Islamic Studies and Christian-Muslim Relations on the faculty of the Duncan Black Macdonald Center for the Study of Islam and Christian-Muslim Relations at Hartford International University. Dr. Grafton holds a PhD in Islamic Studies from the Center for the Study of Islam and Christian-Muslim Relations at the University of Birmingham, England, an MDiv from Luther Seminary in St. Paul, Minnesota, and a BA from Capital University in Columbus, Ohio. Dr. Grafton is the author of many articles, chapters, and books, including The Christians of Lebanon, Political Rights and Islamic Law, Piety, Politics, and Power, Lutherans Encountering Islam in the Middle East, The Contested Origins of the 1865 Bible, Contributions to the 19th Century Nahda, and now most recently, Muhammad in the Seminary, Protestant Teaching about Islam in the 19th Century. His academic interests focus on the history of Christian-Muslim relationships, Lutheranism and Islam, Christian theological perspectives on Islam, the history of Christianity in the Middle East, and American Christian perspectives of religion and society in the Middle East. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Grafton, who's trying to finish his lunch for the day.
And sign your book. This is ain't done. I didn't want to get oil on it. Well, thank you very much for the invitation. At Hartford, we too have our what we call collegial sharing, which is similar to this once a month, where we get together and share recent work or papers or things that we're interested in doing. So this is a familiar kind of experience also while we're trying to eat together. So anyway, I've had a great time so far. Lecture last night, and then in Jason's class this morning, talking about various aspects of the book with students, which was very engaging, and the students were engaged, and there was some great questions and good conversation. So I very much appreciate the opportunity. I just want to talk a little bit about what I hope might be of it, pique some interest in you or curiosity about the book, and kind of why I wrote it, and some of the things that I came out of the research with, and what might be done with it, I guess, moving forward. The book actually started out back in 2012 when the Association of Theological Schools in America, which is the accrediting agency of most seminaries and rabbinical schools in the country, added an outcome to its Master of Divinity program, and that was that students needed to demonstrate their ability to navigate a multicultural and multi-faith America, basically. So this meant that seminaries had to suddenly, if they weren't already, they had to demonstrate that their MDiv students were engaging other religious traditions in some way, shape, or form. This was done in a variety of ways. Often seminaries would invite a rabbi to come in and give a lecture, or an imam. That was the bare minimum that some would do. All the way up to co-teaching courses or joint courses with the rabbinical college or Muslim students from a religious studies program. All kinds of ways that it could be done. But some seminaries actually refused to do it under principle. They were training ministers, Christian ministers, so why did they need to learn about other religious traditions? And if so, it was for the purposes of evangelization. At the time, I was at Philadelphia, the Lutheran Seminary in Philadelphia, and the dean at the time, predecessor, had done a great job in developing the idea of interfaith dialogue, and he himself is Indian, so long history himself of interreligious encounter and conversation. So we were unique at the time, and I was thankful to be there and then when I came to Hartford, it was even more so. It was that on steroids. It was not just teaching interfaith dialogue to Christians, but we were all in the same classrooms together, people of multi-faith, of different faiths. So, but I was interested in not only how seminaries were then forced to teach about Islam, but how were they teaching about Islam before this, and the origins. And my area of interest is 19th and early 20th century. So I started thinking about it, and I thought, well, I know enough to know that there were missionaries in the Ottoman Empire who were coming back and giving public lectures, or they were on furlough for a year, so they would stay at like Union Seminary or Princeton, and they would lecture on it. So I figured, okay, there would be missionary views of Islam, and there were student missionary societies that were formed very early on after the Second Great Awakening, and so I assumed that all of this would take place, but I actually was surprised at how much Islam was referenced in the curriculum, both good and bad, and for ancillary reasons in some cases. So what I decided to do was start looking at a number of different Protestant seminaries, primarily on the East Coast, so I could access them, between 1808 and 1836. So I looked at 7, and they all have a different Protestant denominational background. They focus on different things. Gettysburg was rural. Union was right in the heart of New York City. So I thought this would give me a good cross-section. I decided to leave out the divinity schools of Harvard and Yale, even though those were the earliest colleges, primarily because I wanted to focus on seminaries, meaning those institutions that were specifically created to train ministers, as opposed to higher education, where they could stay longer and read the divinity or theology. I also didn't look at Catholic schools, so this is why I was interested in coming here and engaging that. And I didn't include the Methodists and the Baptists, because the Methodists and the Baptists were originally against training ministers. They felt it was against the Holy Spirit. It stifled the Holy Spirit. So even though Methodists and Baptists became the largest Protestant denominations, for about 30 or 40 years, they would not have seminaries. They refused to have seminaries. So I thought, okay, that takes them out of this. And I used the work of Miller, who's a professor at Bangor Theological Seminary, who wrote a trilogy on the history of Protestant seminary education, which was really helpful as I began looking at this. So I started looking at a number of things in the library, books that were available in the library, which led me to accession lists, which led me to student borrowing records, like where the students actually borrowing the books that were required to read. The catalogs of all the seminaries had a list of the courses, the curriculum. In the archives there were lecture notes, syllabi, public lectures that were published, which was very common. And that gave me all kinds of things to look at and ponder, which was really cool to do. I'm a historian by training, and so getting in the archives was fun. But of course, I was doing this in the winter of 2020, and so I was at New Brunswick Seminary. Let me get my time out so I know how long should I go, by the way?
We usually ask the presenters 30 to 35
Yeah,
minutes,
okay.
and then
Yeah.
25 minutes.
Yep.
Q&A.
So I was at New Brunswick Theological Seminary in the basement when I was tapped on the shoulder, and the archivist said, just so you know, when you're done here, we're locking the library up. I said, yeah, I know you close at 5. I'll be out by 5. No, you don't understand. We're closing the library like this. For COVID, we're closing. So they literally locked the door on me on the way out, and they weren't open for another 2 years. So the research was kind of stopped mid-research, and then I had to then start engaging librarians who were more than happy at that time to do remote scanning and things, and so it did work out, but as you all know, research challenges come up. So anyway, in the book, I came out with a number of areas that if I can use your book just briefly for I came out with a number of different areas where I found Islam referenced and referred to regularly. The first was in the books that were available in the library. There were a lot of translated materials from Latin material that was translated into English, some Orientalist works that were widely available in all of the seminaries, including translations of the Qur'an that were there. Church history textbooks that were imported from Germany and translated from German into English that became standard textbooks referred to Islam regularly, not necessarily in bad ways, but in interesting ways. Then there was a new development with the development of anthropology and sociology. Comparative religions took off, and so Islam came to be seen as a part of the comparative religion study, and I'll talk about that in a minute. And then most interestingly I find is the Qur'an and Arabic became an ancillary part of biblical studies because it was a Semitic language. And I'll talk more about that. And then finally, of course, there were references through missionary lectures and the development of mission, but that actually was only a small part of all of what I found in reference. So the first that I think is, I want to talk about two of these chapters, and one is the Qur'an and Arabic and biblical studies, and the second is the kind of comparative religions view. So there was a view in the 19th century, going back to all the way back to the 17th century, that Arabic as a Semitic language could assist biblical scholars in reading the Hebrew Bible, because the Hebrew Bible has many words and phrases that are only in there once, hapax legomenon. They're only referenced once. So how do you translate one Hebrew word that you have? And prior to the discovery of the Qumran manuscripts, we only had the Hebrew text. I mean, there were medieval Hebrew texts, but nothing earlier. So there was this idea that we have all of these Arabic manuscripts, we have all of these Arabic grammarians and dictionaries on grammar from the medieval period in Arabic that talk about a wide variety of languages and words. So it was the idea that if we could read Arabic, it would help us understand the Hebrew Bible better. And Edward Robinson, who taught at Union, he didn't know Arabic, but his best friend was a missionary in Syria, Eli Smith, who translated a Bible into Arabic. He got all kinds of manuscripts and information from Eli Smith about a whole world of medieval Arab theologians and grammarians. And he said, we have all this material that actually is around us, but nobody can read it because nobody's learning Arabic. So he himself did not read Arabic, but he encouraged his students to begin reading Arabic. And so very early on, actually, seminaries, Hebrew professors also began writing Arabic grammars. So Moses Stewart, who was the first Hebrew professor at Andover Seminary, wrote his Hebrew grammar and an Arabic grammar, even though he was really bad at Arabic. But he thought, okay, this is one of the best ways that we can get to Hebrew. So for a long time, there was this view that Arabic, Syriac, Ethiopic, as all Semitic languages, can help us understand this static Hebrew text. So this was before Qumran, before all this stuff. And that became really important for many of the seminaries, where upper-level students not only took Hebrew, but they took Syriac and Arabic to help them. And at several places, Union, Hartford, and New Brunswick, they actually began using verses from the Qur'an in their manuals. So, in other words, they would have students begin reading the Qur'an to help them read the Hebrew text and to help them do vowel pointing. You know what vowel pointing is? Like where you have only consonants and you have to figure out what the vowels are, so you have to do the same thing with the Qur'an. So he would use this as a way to help them learn how to point vowels in Hebrew by reading Quranic surahs or passages. Now, John Julian Lansing, who wrote this one, also had some interesting theological reflections on some of the passages, some of the surahs that he included. but most of them just used it for linguistic purposes, which was really interesting because that meant that a whole generation of Christian ministers, primarily Presbyterian, Reformed, Lutheran, were all, if they didn't learn or retain Arabic, and most of them didn't retain it, they were being taught that Arabic was a part of this biblical worldview, that it was Semitic and it was something very different. It was not necessarily just an Islamic language, which feeds into the second thing that I want to talk about, and that is this kind of general worldview that at the late 19th century, during the Gilded Age, if you will, the Reconstruction era, in which there was this view of what I call religious Darwinism, that after Reconstruction, during the Gilded Age, America had arrived, and American Protestantism was considered to be, for these seminaries, the pinnacle of religious human achievement. And so I include on the cover of the book a section of Edwin Bashfield's mural called Civilization, or The Rise of Civilization, which is on the rotunda at the Library of Congress. So when you go into the Library of Congress, you look up, you'll see this huge mural. And it was done in 1898, so end of the 19th century, during this period. And it kind of, for me, it symbolizes the way people were thinking about religions at the time. That in the middle you have civilization, which in the center of American capital, this is America, right? It's American exceptionalism at its greatest. But what's included in here is Islam is included as one of the steps to progress. Okay. So all these civilizations, all these religions contributed to the progress of humanity, which is finding its pinnacle in America. And so here you can see a very interesting part where Islam is both recognized, you have it part of the step of civilization, and Islam is a bare-chested turban man with his foot on a flask there, symbolizing like the contribution of science and the role that Arab medicine and Arab science contributed to the progress of civilization. But it's also kind of very Orientalist, right? You have this a turbaned Arab with a bare chest. So it's both kind of and for me anyway, it's both like a positive recognition, but it's also kind of paternalistic in that regard. But that was the view. That was the view that these seminary professors had, and I'll leave that here. And so that led them at the time to begin thinking about religions. So following the work of Max Muller, who was a linguist and began arguing that or studying the various languages in the world and religions in the world, Max Muller put together the Ancient Near East text volumes, which included a translation of the Qur'an. But Muller began to see this as, a manifestation of human spirituality. God created us all as humans, and we all exhibit this spirituality. But it was James Freeman Clarke, an American, who kind of racialized this and put this into a hierarchy where Protestantism was at the top and all the way back down to what he called the ethnic religions at the bottom. So there was this progress of religious revelation, which comes out for me in this mural. And that was pretty common in the seminaries. So seminarians were being taught up until the 1920s, at least, that Islam was part of this human movement towards civilization, and that Arabic was an important part of the biblical story, even though Muslims in their own countries and contexts hadn't quite achieved the status that they needed to. They didn't quite get there, right? So Muhammad, in some of the biographies that were created in the 19th century, Muhammad was seen as an Arab cultural hero, for bringing monotheism to the Arabs, and yet he was still not civilized, if you will, right? So he was left behind, or he didn't quite get there. So he's appreciated, but still not truly a true religious figure in that sense. So that was the common view up until the 1920s, and when the American university system comes into existence, that begins to change the way seminaries function. So for me, what's interesting in this is, and I argue with my colleagues at Yale all the time, that actually the seminaries were like I don't want to say way ahead, but they were the earlier places where some of these things were being taught and discussed prior to universities, because the colleges were still doing rote memorization techniques, reading classics, reading Greek, reading Latin, and it was the seminaries where a lot of this interesting stuff was going on until the university system came online as we know it today, and then seminaries began focusing on more practical things like pastoral care and preaching and liturgy and things like that. So, so that's what I found out. It was a great journey, and of course, in talking with people here, there's all kinds of things I need to follow up on that. So I welcome your questions.
Thank you. Can I start?
Yeah.
As you know well, there's a famous article, I do American religion.
Yeah.
A famous article by Arthur Schlesinger Jr. called The Critical Period in American Religion. It looks at American religion between 1875 and 1919. So from Reconstruction to again World War I. And he said there were massive social and intellectual crises. And the three big intellectual crises are Max Muller, what's the JEPD, who's the
Wellhausen.
Julian
Wellhausen, yeah.
Documentary hypothesis.
Yeah, right.
And he said that Max Muller caused a big crisis because his argument was that all the great world religions, including Islam and Christianity, taught some form of the Golden Rule. So the big question among mainstream Protestants was, if Islam and Judaism teaches the Golden Rule, and you could argue that the Golden Rule is central to Jesus' own thing, what's the uniqueness of Christianity here then? And so that very insight, the translation kind of relativized Christian. Did you see any of that among the Protestant seminaries? Were they worried about the relativizing influence of someone like Max Muller?
Yeah, there was definitely a split, right, as there are in most faculties. There were those people who really bought into the comparative religions and thought this was really helpful for understanding religion. And there were those who were very much against that idea of relativizing. So someone like Samuel Zwemer, who was a missionary in Cairo, came and taught Princeton. Like, he said, this is dangerous thinking, and in the book I actually reference some of his writings against the comparative religions idea. So there was definitely a split. But I think the primary way in which Americans, or at least American seminary professors, responded to Muller was like he saw this as like the human spirit, right? We have all these texts that are exhibitions of what it means to be a spiritual human being. And Clark says, well, yeah, but some are better than others. And there's this progress. And so while on the one hand we can appreciate it, on the other hand it's still flawed.
Yeah, I mean, did you find that, like, James Freeman Clark was Unitarian, okay? Was there a difference in terms of these two approaches to this? Are Unitarians in one camp and Presbyterians in the
No, I wouldn't say it was that neat at all, because you had people. General Seminary, which is an Anglican school or Episcopal school, tended to be the more conservative. They were because they read. They were the bishops required the students to read Latin texts all the way up through the middle of the 20th century. So they were still reading particularly negative works on Islam from the medieval period. And then there were places like Gettysburg, where you had people who, I mean, they were trying to figure out, where do Germans fit into American society, right? Should we continue to speak German, or should we start teaching this in English, and should they pray in English? And so their questions were very different, and again, some of them saw Islam as a weaker religion, right, as opposed to Christianity. But I just think the general time frame of the time, American Protestantism, whatever shape or form people were living in at the time, was seen as.
I'm sure you're aware. John Ziegler Sargent painted a very famous mural on the ceiling of the Boston Public Library called "The Progress of Religion."
Oh yeah.
And it's much more overt. At least
Is it?
Where Christianity is on one side, Protestantism is on one side, and you have Judaism and Islam on the other. And so you walk into the long third floor corridor.
That's
the whole,
right.
The whole ceiling
Yeah.
is filled with this.
That's right. Thank you for mentioning that.
We're all becoming Protestants. What?
Yeah.
How is the Catholic?
Not well.
Yeah.
So it's sort of like it's worse. It's on the third floor.
Yeah, thank you for mentioning that. I have seen it, but so I'll have to go take pictures of it. Is it?
Yeah,
I'm sure they're out. I'm sure they're out.
Spectacular.
Yeah.
Spectacular.
But made me think also when you're showing that Library of Congress piece about the Gaston Hall mural,
Right.
that it has a depiction of religion and education and art working together, and that would have been what
1919.
Yeah. That was
Yeah, right.
interesting too, from the Catholic perspective.
Yeah. Interesting. What I like about the research is that, like, you get into people's lives, like these stories of people's lives, and my wife is a librarian. So a couple of stories that come up is the problem of pastors' libraries. Like, what do you do when a pastor dies? What do you do with their library? So there's a couple of stories in here where a bishop or a pastor, they give their library over to their alma mater or whatever. And, like, they're not sure what to do with it. Like, so in some cases, these boxes of books sit in the basement for years. Well, the librarians try to figure out what do I do with these? But what's important about them is that they show you what these pastors were reading during their day, right? What was in their library and what were they referencing? So those were really important, like, lessons. And my wife she's the director of the library at Hartford, so she gets calls all the time. My spouse just passed away. We have a big library. Can we donate it? And she's like, well, we'll come look at it, and so I go with her as much as I can to look at these things because it's interesting to see. Oh, I know what year you went to seminary because you're reading Raymond Brown and things like that, right? So you learn a lot from these personal libraries about what was read and inculcated. So, yeah.
Hi, I'm Dan Jocelyn
Hi, Dan.
Sandusky.
Yeah.
Nice to meet you. I actually grew up in Windsor, Connecticut. My great-grandmother studied at Hartford to be a missionary, but never went. She stayed behind.
Maybe
married.
she met somebody, yeah.
Yeah, but anyhow, she got married 3 or 4 times. So, interesting lady.
Yeah.
Anyhow, different story. I grew up in the neighborhood where you all are. It's a lovely place. Mm-hmm. So I direct the Center for Christian Jewish Learning here, and I'm really what I kept thinking about was the old notion of Hebraica Veritas, kind of Hebrew truth. That and this is Augustine's classic notion of the Jews, right? They are allowed to continue to exist as a separate people, so they can preserve the truth of the Hebrew Scriptures. And so part of what I'm hearing, in a way, I'm wondering if this study of Arabic and Islam is, in a way, kind of ancillary to supporting this kind of other scaffolding of Christian ideals, that there's a truth in here that is foreign to us that we need non-Christian aid to access. So I'm sort of wondering how there's not only a theology of Islam at play here, but you're also able to discern a theology of Judaism or a theology of these related religions in 19th century Protestant circles.
Yeah, good question. In my reading, there was definitely an anti-Jewish bias. Mm-hmm. So they, unlike Augustine, they thought that the Masoretic text, which was the pointed vowels, was corrupted. Mm-hmm. That the Talmud had corrupted the original Hebrew Bible. Right. So the way to get around that was, as one student said in class, there's a workaround, and your workaround is the other Semitic languages that you have. So those were the particular scientific tools to get at the truth of the text.
Right.
But then the truth of the text was definitely not through Jewish sources.
Right.
It was through other sources.
So they're not in conversation with the developing Wissenschaft des Judentums
No.
school in Berlin, even though that's happening at the same moment.
Yeah, it is. But in my reading of it, at least in this case, a lot of the German scholarship does come over to America. I mean, they love German scholarship, but it's primarily Jewish scholarship on Islam that becomes more important.
Right.
And if I remember correctly, when they did the American Revised Version of the King James, that they did not use those Jewish sources.
They didn't use the Masoretic text.
Well, they did as one of it, but they
Okay.
were using other sources, primarily Christian sources and Arabic sources. 'Cause
Right. Interesting.
in fact, one of the on the committee, Henry Van Dyke, who was a missionary in Syria, was one of the translators of the Arabic Bible that's still used today in the Arab world as their kind of King James, and he was very much a part of the revision of the American Old Testament, that version. So, and I think we've lost all that. I mean, we've lost that kind of appreciation for the Semitic languages. And as I was saying last night, I mean, when I took Hebrew, I had to buy my Brown Driver Briggs, which was the dictionary, right? And
I wrote my dissertation on Charles Briggs.
oh, did you really? Okay, fascinating. Yeah, right.
I know more about the Brown
Yeah. So here's the thing about
human beings.
Oh, well, good. I'll pick your brain. Let me get your email then, because I want to follow this book up on an article on this, because like the BDB is still used as a reference. It's a standard. And you flip through there's Ethiopic, there's Syriac, there's Arabic in there. To my knowledge and my experience, nobody references that.
Right.
Why? Right? I mean,
We have to know too many languages.
yeah, right, exactly. So I need to start polling my Old Testament and Hebrew Bible colleagues to find out, like, how do you use this? Like, have you ever set your students to look up a word that has an Arabic or Syriac cognate? My sense is no, right? Because most of them aren't even learning Hebrew, so.
Right. That's true.
Yeah.
Questions?
Because I was wondering, when you're talking about the, and I know this is not what you've been working on, but talking about the seminaries, the Protestant seminaries, were the Jesuits or any Catholic seminaries, what were they doing on this?
Yeah, that's the thing. I don't know. I didn't look at like St. Charles in Philadelphia or St. Mary's in Baltimore. It
They
would be
were
good.
not on it, but I think Woodstock is the big American Jesuit seminary. I'm pretty sure they were teaching Hebrew and maybe Arabic. So it's sort of like, because we ran big schools in the Middle East and Syria.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah. So I'm pretty
Yeah,
sure.
but I wonder how that lines up with kind of the work with critical biblical scholarship before 1943's Stefano Fonte, which really kind of opens up critical
The
scholarship.
Jesuits weren't big Catholics even then.
Well,
so
yeah.
We were using historical criticism long before. the
Yeah,
Catholics
right.
started, so-
Yeah, right.
Yeah, that'd be a really interesting history to
Yeah.
explore more. Right.
Yeah, it would, because I mean, there's this long history of relationships with the Maronites, and you know the Maronite College in Rome, and I mean the Vatican has all kinds of Arabic literature,
Yeah.
right? Arabic texts. So what I don't know is how that was, if that was transported to the U.S. and when.
Well, we could look at the old Weston course catalogs, for instance, right?
Yeah. But what is now the School of Theology and Ministry, which for my many sins I was made to dean of across the way. That was the Weston School of Theology when it was founded, which is in Western Massachusetts.
Yeah.
And that most of that collection is in the School of Theology and Ministry library, so you can find
Well,
out.
when was Weston established?
1920 something.
Okay,
Moved
so
into
interesting.
suburban, and then moved into Cambridge, Massachusetts in very early 70s, 71. Yeah. So, I was always, see, this is intriguing to me because when I was working on Briggs, and I had to spend all my time at Union Theological Seminary, which has a fantastic collection.
Yeah,
but
absolutely.
I was surprised that at the end of the library, which is the Harvard Divinity School library, there's like floors and floors of Arabic material, and I thought, where did all this stuff come from? I know Moses, all the people at the old Andover, when Andover merged with HDS, all that came to Harvard, I know. But
some of it went to Yale, but most of it's still in the So a lot of it came from these missionaries. So, Moses Stewart, I don't know how much he brought back, but he would have been the first. But it was Eli Smith, who was in Beirut, who was actually for a long time sending material with Edward Robinson.
Right.
And Edward Robinson, he didn't read Arabic, but he would travel back to Europe, and he was given money by both Andover and Union to buy books, to buy manuscripts and stuff. Right. So he would bring a lot of that stuff back, and Eli Smith was making recommendations to him about what he should get in terms of the Oriental languages and things. So I remember doing in my previous book, going to Houghton and looking in archive box of Eli Smith, and it was uncatalogued. But they let me look at it. It was a box, and it was just a box of Arabic scripts and handwriting and like notes. It was like his letters to a local sheikh and his poetry, and it's all just like uncatalogued, just like in a box. It's like somebody shook it up like this. But it's, there's a story there, right? A huge story to tell.
Did he have much success in his evangelization?
No. Yeah. The Protestant church in Syria and Lebanon is pretty small, but in terms of cultural impact, it had quite a big impact. So Boutros Boustany, who was a friend of his, who became a Protestant, wrote the first Arabic dictionary, in the modern Arabic dictionary, in the 19th century. So there was a huge cultural impact, but the Jesuits were very active in Beirut, of course, at the time. So there was this kind of Cold War of translating the text. Right?
St. Joseph's, we went to go to St. Joseph's University, which is, I think today, 25,000 students.
Yeah, right.
It's a big university.
Yeah, it's a big university. Yeah.
So this all ended in some way. I've done my time at Protestant Seminaries, and all this interest is gone. And so when did it end? Did it end with the end of British colonialism, American intervention?
My reading is it ended when the universities came online.
So 1930s, 20s?
1890s.
Okay.
When people started, like at Columbia, Gothiel was a Jewish German scholar, was appointed. He had been teaching at Union. He was appointed at Columbia. And then Johns Hopkins came on board, and they started bringing over German scholars. And so, and then Chicago and University of Michigan. So those places that had money, that had donors, could bring German scholars over to begin, and then people who were interested in this, the only place previously had been the seminary, now they could go to the university. And then by the 1920s, you had archaeology that becomes important, like Assyriology, Egyptology. And so more money gets thrown to that. And so people are interested in that. So I think just by virtue of attrition in numbers, interesting students.
One way of getting at that was look at the dates of the buildings of divinity schools.
Right.
But Andover Hall was built in the 1930s. Yale, the quadrangle at Yale was built.
Yeah. And also the 20s, the social gospel movement comes along, and so what's really important is how you interact with people, what your skill set is as a clergy, and preaching and administration, and less the whole debate about.
Right. But you also have the end of mainline Protestant mission in the same way, and you only wanted to have Protestant mission in the classic model retained in the evangelical circles, and that must do something also with kind of a
probably
connection.
Yeah, well, after 1910, the World Missionary Conference in Edinburgh, there's World War I, and that kind of destroys all hopes of kind of world evangelization because we've just destroyed each other. And then by the 30s, I think it's the 30s that the layman's report comes out of Hartford. 1932. So then, which rocks the Protestant world, like, okay, mission is supposed to be U.S. aid, right? And the social gospel movement becomes the primary focus.
Back when we used to do USA.
Right, exactly.
It's only been a month.
Yeah.
So Tana, you're the expert here, besides David.
I was listening to various pieces of this conversation, and one thing that I was thinking when we were talking about the paintings is that there's also a sculpture, I believe in the Supreme Court building, that shows Muhammad as a lawgiver.
Oh yeah, and the Supreme Court, yeah.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
I always thought, from my perspective, not having known any of this about the role that Islam and Arabic played in the seminaries, why was it that this would have been considered part of American heritage,
right.
part of mainstream American intellectual and legal development in a way that no one seems to remember today?
Yeah, exactly.
And that's a huge part of what I think the value of this book is at a time when we're hearing so much about Judeo-Christian values that we're forgetting that Islam was also a part of that.
Absolutely.
So there's a real opportunity there to help re-educate the American population about our own history, as well as the educational aspect of it, looking in the book how these seminaries were initially built out of parsonage parlors and the pastor's personal library, and the lengths to which people would go for access to knowledge and information and books. Speaks to me as a bibliophile.
Yeah, right,
Yeah.
absolutely.
How do we
Like William
spark
Bentley,
this
who
in our
was in
students
Boston,
today?
was getting these merchants to purchase books in the Ottoman Empire, bring back so he could start reading them and figure out what they were saying.
Your father was a Lutheran pastor, right?
Yes,
Does he have books on Islam?
not that I have ever seen. Now I'm going to have to go and dig through his library. 'Cause I know where all his seminary materials are.
Yeah, see, when I went to seminary, it was like the only aspect. I was interested in Islam at the time, but the only kind of curricular part of it that I could get was I took an independent study, number one, but then it was all relegated to maybe your senior year you could do an elective on world religions. That was it. So it's clear that they were learning more about Islam in a deeper way, or had access to more aspects of Islam than we do now.
I'm just curious, does Hartford Seminary offer a degree in Islamic, the sort of an Islamic version of an MDiv to its students?
Sort of. Like, so Muslims don't require, like Muslim communities don't require an MDiv, but if Muslim chaplains in the military have to have an MDiv equivalent, it's called. So they will come to us for an MDiv equivalent, which is 72 credit hours.
And when I was dean, I learned from Dan Elshofer at the time, was the head of the ATS, association, that the ATS does not accredit rabbinical schools.
They do now.
Oh, do they now?
It's within their mandate for Christian and Jewish institutions. I think there's 2 rabbinical colleges that are in ATS.
Okay, that's new.
That's primarily because they often have their fall meetings over Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, which is like, you might want to rethink your scheduling now that you have Jewish rabbinical colleges in your...
Exactly.
Yeah. But it is within their mandate now.
Because for years, BTI, I was the chair of the BTI board for years. The Islamic scholars are trying to establish a school at, I think at BU, to train people who are, I don't know what came of that.
Yeah, their Boston Islamic Seminary is, you may know more about it than I mean, they're in the process of accreditation.
Right.
They're not accredited now, but they're an affiliate member, I think, now or something.
The Graduate Theological Union has Zaytuna College.
Yeah, they're
is affiliated with the Graduate Theological Union with an undergraduate component.
Yeah.
Ironically, they moved into the old Dominican. Oh, no,
Maybe not ironically.
the old Franciscan property when the Franciscan School of Theology moved back down to San Diego.
Right.
So that's their interesting place where that's being incubated.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a couple other places. In Chicago, Islamic College has been accredited now. They have an undergraduate and master's program. And then there's a place in Houston, but I don't think they're accredited yet.
Yeah.
So Hartford has been one of the only places that Muslims can go to get an accredited degree that's credentialed, that military, hospitals, universities will.
Jane Smith was a force of nature, so if anybody can do it, she can.
Yeah,
certainly do it.
that's right.
So,
That's right.
thank you very much, David.
All right, thank you.